Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Blood and Product Safety session at NHF's annual Bleeding Disorders Conference. My name is Nathan Schaefer. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Joanna Gray and Mark Skinner, to share with you a number of updates that pertain to blood and product safety in an unprecedented era. One of the things we wanted to make sure you are aware of to get the most out of this session is that the speakers are available to answer questions or comments throughout the session. So we encourage you to utilize the chat function to input any kind of questions or concerns. You can also email questions to follow up with the speakers. You can use the function to ask a follow-up question, and the speakers will be in communication with you at a later date. We'll talk briefly at the end of the session about evaluations, but we really encourage you to give us as much feedback as possible. This session is being recorded and will be available to participants, as will be all of the PowerPoint slides that you are about to see. Like I mentioned, I'm Nathan Schaefer. I'm joined by my colleagues Joanna and Mark. Joanna and I do not have many disclosures to share. Mark does. Most of them are all research related and they're listed here. And if you have any questions about them, we can address them. This is our robust and considerable agenda for the session this evening. We're planning to cover quite a bit about safety considerations in the context of COVID-19. We're going to talk quite a bit about pandemic preparedness and some information about supply considerations and some information about the NHF and HFA Safety Summit that was hosted in early 2020. And we're going to address plasma as treatment for COVID-19. To be clear, this session was recorded on July 6th. There may have been more development between that date and today in early August, in which case we will address that in the chat function and we'll be able to address any kind of updates that have transpired in the past month. Want to share that NHF has been very communicative with our community about updates that pertain to COVID-19 from early April throughout all of the things that have transpired in recent months. We've been quick to update the community about what COVID-19 means for the bleeding disorders community. Similarly, the World Federation for Hemophilia has been very transparent and very timely in their response to information that has arisen as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic. And we will share at the end of this presentation quite a number of links that will get you to a number of resources. With that, I am going to turn it over at this point to my colleague, Mark Skinner.
Thanks, Nathan. It's great to be with everyone this evening. So certainly COVID-19 is on all of our minds, and one of the first questions that we all ask when there is a new virus or pathogen is, what does it mean for those of us that are living with hemophilia or one of the other bleeding disorders? So the first question is, are the treatment products that we use, that are typically used for treating hemophilia, safe? Is COVID-19 transmissible? And so that is really the focus of this section of the talk. So this is from a statement from the World Federation of Hemophilia, which draws on recent literature published by Mike Bush and Lou Katz and their colleagues, really looking at the implications of blood collection and the safety implications. Because plasma-derived medicinal products are widely used in the treatment of bleeding disorders, it was important for us to assess and report. And so it is clear that the viral inactivation and elimination procedures that are used in the treatment products do destroy lipid-enveloped viruses such as SARS-CoV-2, also known as COVID-19. For people with hemophilia or other bleeding disorders that are treated with products other than virally inactivated products such as cryoprecipitate and platelets, the treatment decision and the calculation may be a little bit different, and one really needs to think about balancing the risk of a bleeding event in relation to the risk of acquiring a transmissible infection. And I'll talk about what that possibility is in just a moment. So further good news as it relates to plasma-derived medicinal products. It's not just the assessment of the World Federation of Hemophilia and the National Hemophilia Foundation, but the two leading international manufacturing trade associations that represent all of the manufacturers that distribute products within the United States have both assessed that their viral inactivation products do eliminate COVID-19 and that the safety of plasma protein therapies should not be a concern for our community. But it is important to recognize that plasma therapies do remain an important treatment for many. And while we have a range of treatment options available for hemophilia and von Willebrand disease, many people only have plasma-derived treatment products or are still dependent upon blood bank components such as cryoprecipitate and fresh frozen plasma. So we need to look beyond just those that are manufactured into products with viral inactivation steps in between. So the World Federation of Hemophilia has recently published the third treatment guidelines edition, and the WFH and NHF strongly recommend the use of virally inactivated plasma-derived products or recombinant products in preference to fresh components such as cryoprecipitate and fresh frozen plasma because of the known safety risk or potential to transmit a virus. And while most of our products do go through viral inactivation, it is important to recognize that cryo and FFP still remain widely used around the world, and therefore we continue to follow the safety of all blood and blood products. This just gives you a sense of the scope and the scale of the importance of plasma. And while most patients within the United States would have access to a plasma derivative or recombinant or non-replacement therapy, 43% of patients in low-income countries and 34% in lower middle-income countries report that they have a primary reliance on plasma products. And you can see that cryoprecipitate also is widely used. So it really becomes important to us to think about whether COVID-19 is in fact a transfusion transmissible virus. So the first thing that we did was to look to the literature. And so this article is a very recent article, just within a couple weeks, again from Lou Katz. Lou has summarized the current literature and has highlighted that there is no precedent for transmission of a respiratory virus such as COVID-19 through blood. And this is very similar to what we saw with SARS and MERS, the two previous coronaviruses. This is further underscored and cited in the paper that the FDA also concurs that there are not known to be any respiratory viruses that are blood transmitted. So just to think about what it means to be a transfusion transmitted disease, there are essentially 4 questions which must be answered yes. So these are summarized in detail in Dr. Katz's paper. But first, the agent must be present in the blood of a donor who can be qualified to donate. The agent must survive in the collected component. It must find susceptible cells to infect and proliferate once infused. And then the individual that is the recipient must become ill. If you did a question-by-question analysis, you would find that COVID-19 fails on a number of these. And in particular, it is not known to survive in collected components, and therefore it does not meet the test of being transfusion transmitted. So there has been one other paper which accompanied the Katz commentary, which I just mentioned, was a group by Corman and colleagues, which then looked at the risk of transfusion transmission and looking at actual specimen collections from individuals. And so looking at oral swabs and sputum and blood samples from asymptomatic and symptomatic individuals to assess the risk. So the question really becomes whether an asymptomatic individual might come into the system and whether or not they could actually contribute to a lot. And it was, and while it is evident that there were positive serum samples, there was no evidence, again, in this study that it is transfusion transmissible. And further comfort to that point is, given the robust screening that occurs in the donor room, whether it's in a blood setting or in a plasma center, an individual who is showing symptoms of COVID would likely be excluded, and therefore the risk is even further negligible. One final piece of comfort is the American Association of Blood Banks, which is an international standard-setting agency for blood collection organizations. The FDA here in the U.S. and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have not recommended any changes in blood collection establishment procedures, donors, or donor room and that further underscores the point that they think the risk of transfusion transmission of COVID-19 is extremely low. So I think what we can take away from this is not only are the plasma-derived medicinal products that go through robust viral inactivation not going to transmit COVID-19, it's highly unlikely and the risk is negligible that those that are dependent upon fresh components would receive COVID-19 through their therapy as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Nathan.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we wanted to give a few updates that pertain to U.S. policy and pandemic preparedness. These are a few examples of some communications that we've had from NHF and our APLUS colleagues. It's a coalition of organizations that represent users of plasma products. In coalition, we have registered concerns with the federal government about the need for plasma collection facilities to have personal protective equipment, and why it's so important that people continue to donate blood and plasma during the pandemic. We also have some recommendations from MASAC, which is our Medical Advisory and Scientific Advisory Committee. They have recommendations about the availability of product that all patients should have on hand in their home, and we've had to do some advocacy to make sure patients have a robust supply of product in their home. There have been some policy changes that have been announced during the COVID-19 epidemic. In early April, the Food and Drug Administration announced that they were going to harmonize behavior-based deferral criteria that formerly excluded people from donating. One of them that is of note is the eligibility criteria for men who have sex with men. Prior to April, the policy was that if you had had sex with another man within the past 12 months, you were ineligible to donate blood or plasma. That has now been reduced to 3 months. And that's based on data from other countries, as well as some FDA policies that have made them comfortable with moving forward with that policy change. And though they have been prompted by the COVID epidemic, they are not limited to the pandemic. Those policy changes are going to be permanent. There is, however, a temporary policy change that will allow plasma collectors to release plasma after 45 days in quarantine rather than 60. And as I mentioned, we've done a lot of communication in concert with our colleagues within the APLUS coalition, and all of those communications have been issued jointly. Congress also passed in June of 2019 the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act. I should note that this was not prompted by the COVID-19 epidemic, but certainly the provisions therein were made even more real as a result of the developments in the recent months. They have asked for the Department of Health and Human Services to issue a report to Congress with each of these four following considerations, which Joanna's going to talk about in a moment in terms of the APLUS comments that we had in response to each of these four criteria. But one of the things that we wanted you all to know is that we worked very closely with our APLUS colleagues to ensure that on each of these four working groups, there would be a patient representative. So there is either a patient themselves or someone who works for patient advocacy organizations that is an active member in each of these four areas on each of these four working groups. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna to talk more about our comments from the APLUS perspective.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm happy to share a little more detail about the substance of the APLUS comments to the pandemic preparedness RFI that Nathan just described. And we thought it was worth sharing the kind of details of this with you, not only because I think pandemic preparedness is obviously on everyone's mind these days, but that the comments that we made here are reflective of comments we make kind of generally when blood and plasma product safety and availability issues come up. And so thought it might be useful for community members to kind of know in general the sorts of things that we advocate for. So as Nathan said, there were 4 kind of specific questions that the department has asked for input on, but we opened with some general comments that first, that the national blood policy should be comprehensive. You know, the bill from Congress and the request for information really focused on blood and the need for an adequate and safe blood supply. And of course we agree with that, but know that it can't just be blood, that we need source and recovered plasma to be safe and available and accessible as well. We also reiterated the importance of patient input. You know, the main committee that's working on preparing this report was created as a result of advocacy by NHF and other patient advocacy groups after the HIV crisis, and the need for all policymakers in this area to understand the importance of patient input and kind of focusing on end users of blood and blood products. You'll see throughout the comments here, and it's really kind of a theme of our advocacy in this area. This remains a huge focus of our advocacy efforts because we know how important it is not only to our community but to all end users, and we take that kind of role seriously. The first category was they were looking for strategies to help mitigate challenges associated with the continuous recruitment of blood donors. You know, one way to ensure the availability of blood and plasma is to ensure you have enough donors who regularly donate. And so you can see on the slide here the comments that we made. I'll call your attention to the second one in this section about the need for evidence-based decision-making in determining donor eligibility. You know, we always emphasize the need for policy decisions to be made based on science and not politics. And that, you know, we have supported policies that have expanded the number and types of people who are able to donate blood and plasma when there has not been evidence of an elevated risk to end users, and that we thought it was worth in this context kind of emphasizing that as well. We also said that though we did support the FDA change that Nathan just described a few moments ago, it wasn't made through their regular process that with notice and comment opportunities. Typically, a federal agency would put out a document saying, here's a policy change we intend to make. They would accept comments, review them for 30 or 60 days, and then come out with a final decision. In this area, there are often public meetings as well associated with this sort of policy change where we could present, other folks can participate to kind of give their perspective. And while that wasn't possible because of COVID, we emphasized the need for that regular process to occur for any future changes. The second category was about ensuring the adequacy of the blood supply in the case of public health emergencies. Again, we affirm the importance of plasma as well as blood. For all, and I think in the next section, Mark will talk a little more about supply issues and how they affect not only us here in the States, but globally. So kind of stay tuned for that thought. But we know that plasma is critically important for us and COVID has taught us some real practical issues. Nathan mentioned the letter we did about the need for PPE for donation centers. That was an issue we heard early on during the COVID crisis, that plasma collection facilities may not be able to continue to function back then because they just didn't have enough masks and PPE, and so we advocated for them to be prioritized. It was also important that the Department of Homeland Security designated blood and plasma collection facilities as essential, which means that even as states or cities shut down different parts of their economy, different types of businesses, that those would be maintained. And so those were things that, I'll be honest, I'm not sure it ever really occurred to me as I thought about a public health emergency, and I think the irony of HHS working on this response during a global pandemic brings many of the issues right to the fore. Finally, we discussed the need for, or encourage them to develop contingency strategies in case of shortages. There have not been shortages experienced so far during COVID. We don't anticipate or expect that any will develop. But it's important for strategies to be developed in conjunction with patient advocacy groups so that if there were to be shortages in the future, the demand could be managed appropriately to ensure access to care. The third category relates to the implementation of the Transfusion Transmission Infections Monitoring System, or the TIMS program. This is a hemovigilance program that was developed a few years ago and has really kind of focused on monitoring the impact of donor deferral policy changes in the last few years, and is focusing on HIV, hepatitis C, and hepatitis B. We have advocated for TIMS to be made permanent and more comprehensive with dedicated funding, because if the next pandemic were to be something transmitted via blood, we would want to have a robust hemovigilance system so that we could track that, identify issues quickly, etc. And we also advocate for TIMS data to be transparent and publicly reported so that stakeholders, including patient groups like ours, can have visibility. Finally, they looked for comments related to other measures to promote safety and innovation. So this has to do with technological changes, and you can see here, it's kind of, we closed the letter with the comments at the beginning about the need for policies to decision-making to be based on science. Adoption of new technologies or revised donor eligibility criteria are fine if they don't increase overall risk, and that all policymakers should really keep the end users of blood and blood products at the core of their policymaking. So we anticipate that the final report from HHS will be out before the end of the year. On a parallel track, the Senate Help Committee released a paper asking for policy ideas to prepare for the next pandemic. The Help Committee is one of two committees in the United States Senate that works on healthcare policy. And we submitted comments very similar to what I've just gone through about the need to be prepared for a potential bloodborne pandemic. Many of the elements in the white paper were contemplating another kind of respiratory pandemic, and we have highlighted the need to focus on other types of issues. Chairman Lamar Alexander is hoping to pass legislation in response to COVID before the end of the year, and preparing for the next pandemic. It's something we're closely monitoring and advocating for to make sure that our policy goals and priorities are included as well if a package comes together. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it back over to Mark.
Hello. So thank you very much, Joanna. What I wanted to share a little bit more In Nathan's earlier comments, one of the things he did mention was that MASAC, NHF's Medical and Scientific Advisory Council, had put out guidance that related to home inventory, which was an important concern for our community if there were, in fact, transportation disruptions in delivering product to the home or delays in insurance companies processing refills and authorizations. So while that guidance is there and has been helpful to many of us, the other question that relates to treatment product supply is in fact the whole manufacturing process. So certainly the collection of COVID, certainly the collection of plasma affects the ability to manufacture treatment products. So beyond the recombinant products, which are not directly affected by plasma supply, there is a concern about the plasma supply itself. Fortunately, there is a long lead time from the time that a donor donates plasma, whether it's in a blood center or in a source plasma collection center, until the time it gets into your vein. It's 9 months or longer. So a momentary or a short-term interruption in the ability for donors to donate would have a minimal impact. Some of the policy changes that Nathan already discussed in terms of changing the inventory hold period, while having minimal or negligible impact on overall treatment product safety, did allow manufacturers even further flexibility in planning their treatment campaigns to manufacture products. But should this situation become long-term, it is important for us to think about, and that's why we spent so much time supporting robust collection of plasma. And the other thing that's really important to think about then is the global transportation network itself. While blood is collected and used locally, plasma is really part of a comprehensive global system. I don't really expect you to understand or need to understand these details of these two slides. First, look at the picture on the right side of the screen. And I think you all should be able to see that there's a lot of moving arrows. So plasma is predominantly collected in the United States, and all plasma that goes into U.S. products that are made from plasma comes from U.S. source plasma. But the full manufacturing process does not occur here. The place where the product is manufactured, the place where the filling occurs, the place where the finishing occurs, and the ultimate point of sale could all be in different countries. And so what the arrows on the right side of the screen show is just to give you a sense that there's a vast flow around the world. And so as we all saw with the interruptions in the transportation network, in particular aviation, that could have a long-term impact on the ability to move finished product back to the U.S. so that it's available for you. Given the long shelf life of our treatment products, most of our product is moved by boat. And so the interruption of aviation is not a significant concern, but if the borders were closed and there was an interruption in the ports, we would certainly want to understand. And so robust inventories do exist in the U.S., and we don't think it's a problem, but it is something that we always pay attention to. In terms of the global market, if you look at the slide on the left, you see the very large red bar sitting on top of the United States. It's important for us to note, for all of our global colleagues that live with bleeding disorders, that over 60% of the plasma that goes into the manufacture of plasma-derived products that are used worldwide, the raw material, the plasma, that is the starting material for those products, 60% of that comes from the United States. So if there would be a significant interruption in the ability to collect plasma in the U.S. or something would happen to our blood supply, it would have catastrophic impacts around the world. Europe is a little less dependent, as is China, because China does not allow the importation of U.S. plasma, but the rest of the world is heavily dependent on the U.S. For producing plasma. And just for point of illustration, it takes 1,200 donations to actually treat one individual with hemophilia over the course of the year if they're being treated with a plasma product. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Nathan to talk a little bit about the NHF HFA Safety Summit.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the first ever safety summit that was hosted in January of this year. But by way of background, there were a number of product recalls and quality control issues that transpired primarily throughout the summer months of 2019. And these recalls were very unsettling to many within the bleeding disorders community. They reminded us of what the HIV crisis was like in the 80s, and they forced us to evaluate what are the current communication measures that are in place to inform the community in the case that a product does need to be recalled or that there is a safety concern or issue. So as a result of everything that went down in 2019, we issued a number of medical advisories. We, along with our colleagues at the Hemophilia Federation of America, did our best to update our social media channels to ensure that the community had as much information in the most timely manner as humanly possible. But despite all of that, we decided that we were going to come together. We issued a number of communications to the community. We established a patient voice joint safety inbox where patients could anonymously, if they wanted to, address concerns, raise questions with the national organizations, and we tried to listen to what the community was saying and what they were afraid of. And as a result of all of that, we decided that in January of this year, we were going to convene a 3-day summit in Washington, D.C. We had nearly 100 participants that represented patients, patient advocacy organizations, manufacturers, PPTA, medical providers, specialty pharmacy, and federal agency partners. We had representatives from HRSA, the CDC, and the NIH. The mission statement is articulated here that really speaks to the goals of the summit. As a result of these 3 days and all of the information that was shared, all of the concerns that were expressed, we issued an initial executive summary in the format of a number of PowerPoint slides that are still available publicly on both of the national organizations' websites. And we asked for feedback from community members throughout the course of the spring months. And at the end of May, we ended that opportunity for public comment. We are currently synthesizing all of that information and working on a more robust sort of white paper, if you will, that outlines a number of policy recommendations going forward, which Joanna is going to speak about momentarily. We anticipate that we will have a draft of that final report sometime later this year. But we did have a number of key takeaways that we wanted to share with you during the session this evening. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joanna.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nathan. As Nathan said, all of this information about the Safety Summit is available in the draft summary, which the link was on the last slide, and we can help you find it. You can enter a question in the chat box if you have any trouble. But what I thought was so encouraging about the Safety Summit is that we brought together basically every part of the community that we could think of and tried to just have really honest conversations about expectations, roles, rights, responsibilities, etc. And I was encouraged by how productive those conversations were and how much consensus there was. So this slide and the next one has some of the key takeaways that apply to all stakeholders. Of course, what your view of safety issues depends on what seat you're sitting in. If you're a mom, that's different than if you're an HTC doc, if you're work for a pharma company, if you work at NHF, etc. But there were some things that there really was consensus applied to everyone. I think everyone watching, I'm sure, will agree with this first bullet, that all safety communication really has to be patient-centered. often when there have been safety issues in the past, information first goes to medical providers. Sometimes it's very technical and scientific, and we really all kind of agreed that there has to be a parallel strategy that's patient-centered. Not that things need to be dumbed down for the patient community. I've never met such thoughtful and expert folks about their care as in the bleeding disorders community, but that patient-centeredness needs to be the key of everything for everyone. I'll also mention the second bullet. Often when it comes to safety issues, there are regulatory rules set by, say, the FDA around what type of information a manufacturer has to communicate, what they're not allowed to communicate, and there was a real kind of recognition that regulatory requirements are the floor and not the ceiling. Because of the experience of our community with safety issues in the past, I think there is an special kind of sensitivity. We're especially sensitive to wanting to understand what's happening with safety issues. There's the kind of a paternalistic approach, oh, we're only going to talk to doctors and not patients, or we're only going to do what the FDA requires of us, just isn't going to cut it in our community. And I think all of the stakeholders who were at the meeting appreciated that, and there was a real consensus there. There was also a recognition, though, that all communications channels could be improved. I think there's something to a belts and suspenders approach to communicating safety issues so that you could hear from both your HTC and your specialty pharmacy and your chapter organization and your national organization if there were to be, say, a product recall. But having all those communications channels kind of coordinated and aligned, I think is where we've fallen a little bit short in the past. And then finally, defining expectations for all stakeholders about kind of what their role is in these issues. The second slide has the other key takeaways for all stakeholders. I'll mention just two here. Leveraging social media is something that we discussed a lot. I think social media is both an opportunity and a challenge when it comes to safety issues, when it comes to all communications these days, I suppose. And so the kind of recognition about trusted sources of information using social media to get the word out was important. And then finally, we know that safety is not just a U.S. issue, it is international. And so the need to work with our colleagues around the world to both gather data and to share safety issues as we learn about them. I will tell you several of the safety events that have happened in the last year have led to international discussion about what folks are hearing and what different regulatory bodies are saying. And I know at NHF we really value those international collaborations and know that they'll continue. This slide here, you can see that, so what I just talked through were takeaways for each, for all stakeholders. There were also takeaways for each stakeholder group. We don't have time to go through all 7 of these slides, so I would encourage folks to look for the summary on our website. You can see patients here right on the front. Patients should educate themselves about what are safety issues, what is an adverse event, what should be reported to their provider, etc. Guys, I'm sorry, my computer screen just went black, so I can't, okay. I'm back. Hopefully you guys can see me. And so finally, as Nathan said, the next steps, we are drafting a paper summarizing the meeting, and one of the kind of key action steps for us as national patient organizations was to develop educational materials on safety concepts, look for some pretty snazzy infographics coming your way later this summer and fall. And I think we'll all agree to the infographic on this page, which is that patients really are at the core of safety. And Mark, I'm pleased to turn it back to you for one last section.
Thanks, Joanna. So the last section that I wanted to touch on is, while we've talked about the essential nature of plasma for manufacturing treatment products that we all use, and we've established that with all the relevant government agencies, it is also important that in the news that plasma is thought about as a potential therapy itself, and there's two ways that plasma can be considered. So the first is what we've been hearing about, is the concept of convalescent plasma, which is plasma that is actually collected from someone who's recovered from COVID, and then it's used directly to treat someone who's experiencing complications of COVID. The second is would be a manufactured product, which would be called a hyperimmune, and that's the same scenario. Plasma is collected, but then it's potentially used as a treatment for people who are at risk. And so it becomes, and the main difference between these two is whether it goes through a manufacturing process. So the diagram on the right is very similar to what you would see in a clinical trial, where plasma is collected, it goes through a process, there's a clinical trial, and ultimately the data are analyzed. Looking at the two blocks, the Mayo Clinic is the lead investigation institution under the FDA's accelerated pathway, and AABB both have robust websites on the concept of convalescent plasma. The Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association and a consortium of industry, I've listed a couple websites which describe the work that's going on as it relates to hyperimmune globulins. But it's potential that the therapies that aid us also could be part of the solution for COVID. Just briefly, the first step from the Mayo Clinic has been reporting on the first 5,000 individuals that were transfused with convalescent plasma, and they have demonstrated that convalescent plasma is safe. What the research to date has not been able to demonstrate is whether it's efficacious. And what they're working on now is to see if there are any early indicators to demonstrate product efficacy. There is one randomized controlled trial out of China, which was terminated early and was perhaps underpowered, but it did not demonstrate clinical efficacy using the marker of time to clinical improvement of 28 days using convalescent plasma. So this is very much a rapidly evolving space, and stay tuned to the literature, but we have the potential to be part of something important. So in closing, there's a few takeaway messages. These will be available on the final PowerPoint and a few resources that we're going to make available to you. But viral inactivation and elimination should make the products that we use safe. There's very low risk of transmission in blood components, and plasma itself remains essential not only for us, but potentially for all of the others. Back to Nathan for the final slide.
So as Joanna mentioned, one of the things that the Safety Summit really underscored is that all stakeholders have a role to play in terms of safety considerations, and that includes patients and patient advocacy organizations. And that policymakers are not waiting for the next pandemic to put some of these measures into place. Like we said, some of the legislation that was passed in 2019 was before all of COVID-19. The COVID epidemic has just underscored the importance of taking all of these measures so seriously on all fronts possible. These are a number of resources that have been formed part of the content of today's presentation. So please check those out. And finally, we really encourage you to give us feedback on how this session went. You can look for more directions in the chat function about how to proceed with providing us evaluation. I will say that blood safety is a perennial session at our Bleeding Disorders Conference. Every single year we have this session. In the past 2 years, the content and the interest of this session has only grown with all of the realities of our new world. So it's really important to us that we hear from community members about how this session went this evening, how it could be improved. What else do you want us to incorporate? We really do want to hear your feedback. So with that, I will say thank you so much for joining this evening, and be well.